Hello, folks. Thanks for coming, and thanks to those of you that have been here all day at this symposium. It's a real marathon. It's been a long day with lots of amazing discussions and fantastic insights emerging both from you as an audience as well as the people we've had up here on stage and in the various rooms and workshops and so on. So thank you so much, and thanks in particular for coming to the closing event, which is what we're here for now. My name's Dan Hill. I'm the director of Melbourne School of Design, which is the grad school here in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. I want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to Indigenous elders, or their elders past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous people here tonight, and recognise that this is unceded land, and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. In a moment, we're going to have a keynote from Sarah Ichioka, so I guess that's why you're all here. But before we do that, I would like to actually do something in reverse, in a sense. I'm going to thank some people that I may not have a chance to do afterwards, and because some people go before the end, you might not hear the thanks, and there's a lot of people that have helped make this day happen, so I'll thank them now, if that's okay. So to my fellow organising committee members, Judy Bush, James Halal, Alan March, and Sarah Nasabi in particular. But of that crew, thanks in particular to Anna Hurliman, who has very much been the leader of this initiative and has driven it through with great fortitude and grace and skill, not least in having to deal with me. But it's a large part down to her corralling the rest of us together on the academic side in particular. But also to Rosanna Verde, who has coordinated pretty much all the logistics around it, all of the moving pieces, and Sarah's travel, and Deb's and others, and again had to deal with me, which is the hard part, but everything else has been done by Rosanna. So thank you very much to her as well, and the team behind that, from marketing and comms all the way through to the AV team that make this happen too. So that's Imogen, Maddie, Tiana, Emma, Tim, Basil, Finn, and a whole bunch of other people I'm no doubt forgetting. This is the danger of making a list of names, isn't it? But I'm doing my best. So all have been essential to making today happen. So if you don't mind for a minute, just please join me in thanking all of them. We also have some student volunteers: Din Hyun, Meijie Hao, Alejandro Lara Allende, Anna Beasley, Rujo Liu, Xin Tang, Sam Neve, and Yijia Lu. So thank you, Lee, sorry. Thank you very much to them as well. And all of the panelists and speakers. Yeah, congrats, exactly. This is good, this is getting the energy up in the room, Sarah, we're going well. So, and also in particular to Robert Tresidder, I think I can see you at the back, Bob, so, whose generous donation to the university to create the Tresidder Fellowship in the first place has enabled us to bring Sarah Ichioka here. In the last 12 months alone, we've been able to bring Indy Johar, Philippe Rahman, now Sarah, which is a real privilege for the school, students and staff alike, to bring speakers of this caliber here, and not just to do the talks, but also to spend time with us as a faculty and our partners and collaborators. So thank you to Bob in particular for that generous donation, which we've been able to make a fellowship out of. I hope it reinforces and makes manifest the role of the university as a meaningful civic actor to hold collective conversations like this, particularly about complex things as we have today, in a time and a place where universities are often not valued, it would seem. So thank you once again to Robert Tresidder. But now to our closing keynote. And as we flagged earlier in the day this morning, first thing, when Julie opened the day, it's a fantastic way of bookending to have Deb's opening keynote and then Sarah's closing keynote. And again, it is a real privilege for us. I mean that in every sense, to have Sarah and Deb here with us. Sarah Mineko Ichioka is a strategist, urbanist, curator, and author. She's the founding director of Desire Lines, a consultancy for environmental, cultural, and social impact organizations and initiatives. In previous roles, she's explored the intersections of cities, society, and ecology within leading international institutions of culture, policy, and research in the US, Asia, and Europe. Sarah's been recognized as a World Cities Summit Young Leader and is an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Currently serves on the board of the Clusters Forum in Switzerland, participates in Design Singapore and the Art Science Museum in Singapore, has served as an advisor and a judge for many diverse projects, including the Triennale di Milano, the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge, Water as Leverage for Resilient Cities Asia, the European Prize of Urban Public Space, the list goes on. And she holds degrees from Yale University and London School of Economics and Political Science. As with Deb, Sarah has a fantastic book, which I urge you all to read. And hers is called Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency, co-authored with Michael Polwin, who may be known to some of you for his work on the Eden Centre in the UK, a kind of a pioneering bit of ecologically led architecture. And Michael also jointly initiated the Architects Declare movement that our own Peter Reisbeck has done much to lead here as well. Flourish proposes a bold set of regenerative principles to transform how we design, make, and manage our buildings, infrastructures, and communities. And by regenerative, they write, our concise, ambitious definition of regenerative design and development is that which supports the flourishing of all life for all time, which I like for its concise approach, as we said, but it has that incredibly rich set of possibilities within it, all life for all time. And the book brilliantly and usefully unpacks what that might mean with particular reference to the built and living environment. It describes why, seeing as we've known how to build low or zero carbon buildings forever, more or less, the pace of change on that front in recent decades has been scandalously slow. And Sarah does this not simply through analysis of the political and economic currents flowing through our discourse and how they frame our shared decision-making, but at the deeper level of the self, such as how confirmation bias tends to reinforce existing narratives. In Australia, where you might tick off the set of those things, whether it's the hollow dream of universal home ownership or the lock-ins around car dependency or the more fundamentally dangerous lock-ins around growth. Even as we heard, I must say, on some of the panels today, but that's the point of doing a diverse symposium, isn't it? A Gordon Gekko-like myopia that growth is good, rather than asking after, as my colleague Mariana Mazzucato reminds us, that the direction of that growth is possibly more important. Each of these lock-ins holds us back, but they're no more than lumpy, dusty ideas rather than laws of physics. Each can be reimagined. Sarah's work glides across a glittering array of case studies and stories, and there are plenty of wonderfully inspiring examples in the book, from what we might call a plant-based architecture through to urban food systems and urban parks and gardens. And as a Tresida Fellow, Sarah spent time with students and staff with us over the week and a half that she's with us, from Rory Hyde's architecture studio last Thursday to our PhD researchers on Friday morning. With Sarah and Deb, we're doing a launch of our Melbourne Biodiversity Network's collaboration with Office Architects on Thursday afternoon. And yesterday morning, Sarah hosted a wonderful roundtable with a bunch of people that I also see here, but including various parts of the Victorian government, along with key players from Hassel and Arup and Office and Oculus and Regen Melbourne and Greenfleet, as well as many of my colleagues here in the faculty. But moving beyond the material experiments, like a plant-based architecture, Sarah's work also probes deeper into these immaterial psychological mindsets, the organizational layers, into what Donella Meadows described as the most difficult but powerful leverage points, the paradigms. Meadows' levers are all connected, of course, so that work at the scale of a street is indeed connected to broader cultural circuits. What we think of ourselves as a society, as humans, as places, just as Deb's wonderful talk made clear this morning. In this area, like many of us, see the possibility in Indigenous knowledge systems, including those around us here in Australia, but as we just heard in that wonderful session with Sarah Bear, Taylor Broadbent, and Michaela Ridgway, there is an innate complexity to Indigenous knowledge systems, recognizing that the idea of pan-indigeneity is problematic and complex as well as it is full of possibility. But equally in anthropos Tim Ingold's work with the Inuit peoples and the Sami peoples, traced across the chilly latitudes of my own spiritual home in the far north of the planet, I was excited to read Sarah in Flourish dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty, drawing from that similar place and those peoples. Quote, the Inuit perspective on uncertainty as accepting that the future cannot be known allows appropriate preparation for uncertainty, rather than condemning a traveler to futile struggle against it. Inuit therefore focus on keeping the show on the road, that is, opening up a path to the future in the present, rather than simply becoming over-fixated on the future before it's arrived. We know that that form of acceptance of uncertainty, no matter how pragmatic and generative in reality, is a long way from the faux certainty which politicians, policymakers, and corporate boardrooms are supposed to exhibit. And Sarah's work is particularly exciting, I think, because it moves across the high levels of government, as well as community organizations, setting a course directly for those uncertain spaces, and by doing so opens up diverse paths for the futures in the present. When we are presented with routes which seem to be simply at least better than business as usual, Sarah asks us to deal with the reality that, as she writes, less bad is not the same as good. But her work sidesteps the too easy binaries of optimism versus pessimism and instead deals in a more delicious word, possibilism. So, please join me in welcoming the possibilist, Sarah Ichioka, to the stage. Thank you.
What a generous introduction. Thank you, Dan. All this makes me want to jump right into conversation, but hopefully we'll have time for that. The last time that I was in Melbourne for a public talk, I wasn't really in Melbourne. I was on a screen, and so I'm just reveling in the ability, the luxury of being in time, place with you. And I'm so grateful to Robert Tresidder for his generosity in enabling that, and to Dan, to Dean Julie, Sarah Musavi, and all the symposium conveners, as well as Rosanna, working tirelessly and with great good humor behind the scenes. So what a day it's been. And if anyone needs to stretch or take a deep breath so that we can land in this conversation as opposed to reflecting on everything else that everyone's already shared, please feel free to move around, make noise. I've been really struck by the remarkable convening power of the University of Melbourne, and the incredibly high caliber of conversation and critical thinking that we've seen and heard from. We've heard about infrastructure, we've heard about the flows of the city, policy mechanisms that can influence climate action, how to build capabilities and of what kind within the diverse built environment professions, the emotional aspects of transformation, building material banks, very technical approach, the power of professional organizations, roadmaps for transition, discussions of sovereignty, and so on. And I hope as much as possible that as you're listening to my remarks, you can also reflect on the context in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, where these may or may not be relevant, so that we can establish a fruitful dialogue. We heard from our opening keynote from Deb Chakra about this intense acceleration of energy use, where the addition of green energy, which we've heard so much optimism about from some contributors today, has actually only been additive. So it's great that that supply is increasing, but overall energy usage is increasing. And Deb very helpfully in this slide I stole looks at the map of that energy use acceleration, accumulation against the growing trends of urbanization, which of course gives us the frame through which we are discussing the climate emergency today. The last panel raised some of the prospect of climate destabilization and the movement of people. That's something I think I'd love us to hold in our minds together this evening. The fact that on current trajectories, it's highly likely that up to a third of our global populations spread across a fifth of our land area will be facing average temperatures of approaching 30 degrees or more over the next 50 years, largely concentrated in the global south, already historically disadvantaged through extractive colonialism, and strongly affecting particularly settlements around the equator. So very much top of mind for those of us who are based in Singapore, which is one of the world's most equatorial cities, as well as a significant proportion of the north of this continent. And in the session that I sat in on a new roadmap for decarbonizing Australia's housing stock, there was an invocation of planetary boundaries, and a colleague dialing in from Copenhagen mentioned that it's now very common practice at the start of every meeting of built environment practitioners in the Nordics, or at least in Denmark, to invoke the planetary boundaries. It's still quite a novel framing, I'd say, for the context that I'm largely working in Southeast Asia. And so I think it is worth repeating, also remembering that this is an abstraction, but it's essentially like a ritual apology to Mother Earth for taking her for granted and wounding her in almost every possible way. And I think this is an important frame to remember. Yes, we are talking about the climate emergency as a frame for the symposium today, and that's largely been spoken about through the lens of decarbonization of the built environment, which is natural within the context of cities, but it is absolutely urgently essential, especially when we're thinking about political space for this, that is actually only 1 out of 9 of our concerns. So that, and actually not even the area of greatest harm. And I think it's quite common in places like Australia or Singapore, these highly industrialized contexts, now post-industrial contexts, to say, okay, well, we have really overshot, we've taken too much from Mother Earth, but it's been so good for us. And maybe it's a necessary harm in order to enable our quality of life. But I think it was I was so grateful that Deb raised the point of how that's not necessarily the case for all, and that we can't necessarily see on a global level a correlation between the overshoot of negative impacts and the positive conditions for your average human. So this research juxtaposes the Stockholm Resilience Center's planetary boundaries framework, which was just referenced with Kate Rayworth and the Donut Economics Coalition's framework, where the planetary boundaries are the outer part of the circle or the donut, and then the safe ground inner center is the basic needs and rights of all humans. And if you look across this change, where this is showing the latest data that were available at the time that this paper was published 2 years ago, that actually, even as we've moved into overshoot as a planet, that has not necessarily, on balance, lifted more people into the safe operating space. So that's actually potentially a false trade-off discussion. And who the overshoot has benefited, the responsibility borne by those in the top 10% on the planet, 50% of emissions are, and I absolutely love that Oxfam, who are the originators of this research, pointed out very elegantly that the information data just took the form of an old-fashioned champagne glass. So the top 1% of the very the fizz popping out the top of this old Great Gatsby-style champagne glass, are actually by far disproportionately the highest emitters. And I think this is also really, really important, kind of disaggregation of impact and responsibility that we should be holding alongside the data that others have shared earlier in the day about the disproportionate geographic distribution of emissions. And to get even scarier, if there are any psychologists in the room, you might have a field day with this, but I'm currently finding this certain sort of calm composure in absorbing some of the horrific events in the world by the sense of real clarity about the alignment of capital and political power and patriarchy and extractivism. It's all actually so organized, and it's so organized in order to defend entrenched positions. And I find that even though it's a time of incredible grieving, I think it's also a time of real crystal clarity that I hope can galvanize some of us when we think about whether it's little p or big P politics, to have a little bit more clarity about how questions about distribution of wealth and distribution of political power and concentration thereof have to be a key point of discussion that's running as we activate ourselves in our whole capacity beyond just our professional capacity as built environment professionals. So far, so hard, but I'm actually not going to continue the conversation in that mode. I could relentlessly, and I've actually spent years of giving presentations like that, as have many people who I respect and admire, from inside and outside the built environment. And somehow I thought that if enough of us just kind of processed the facts and woke up to the emergency, that's what would be the catalyst for action. And I think that that's just absolutely been proven to be false, because if you look at any of the trends on any of the planetary boundaries with a small dip for the pandemic-induced stasis on some of our economies, industrialized economies, generalized terror is not an approach that seems to be working to move us. And in fact, that's completely natural. If you look at human psychology and physiology, our natural response to danger, perceived danger, is either to fight, where we might channel all of our energy into expressions of anger, which might bring momentary feelings of solidarity, but actually hijacks our ability to think and organize strategically. Or we know that another response to fear might be flight. And I think that this is where we can see the origins of so much techno-optimism and this sort of escapist fantasy of, quite literally leaving Mother Earth in a suit designed by Prada, very chic. Or designers are involved in this aspect. Or even if it's not an actual embodied experience of riding on a rocket, it's this idea that if we just lean into new technologies, that will be the route out. So we've got fight, we've got flight. And then there's another kind of flight, which I think their designers are also very actively implicit in, which is the flight to escapism into addictive technology. And this is a whole nother conversation to have, but I definitely think that this is one of the key sources of inaction and political apathy, whether passively or by design, depending on who the actor is. This is a huge contributor to the, not stasis, but the kind of acceleration of damage that we see, where it's good people are unable to absorb the reality and react to the fear appropriately, and so we seek escape through these other mechanisms. Or we freeze in a way and kind of try to hold into balance this idea that you kind of need to go on with your everyday while also holding vaguely in your mind this idea that calamity could be just around the corner. And none of these things are getting us where we need to be. So another approach was to write a book with my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Michael Pollan. Dan has already done a great pressy and promo for it. Thank you, Dan. So I will not go into the summary of it, but essentially this was meant to be a starting point for conversation that took a more positive approach, where we were looking at drawing from history, drawing from traditional wisdom, drawing from across disciplines, fantastic examples of new emerging regenerative paradigms of design and development that we saw. And what I love about writing a book is that it becomes a friend who goes around the world and can have conversations on your behalf. And I'm really, really grateful for that capacity. But I want to raise one point of warning, which is that I think almost none of us are experts truly in regenerative design and development. And that I know this was one of the themes of one of the earlier workshops, but that actually this flight into establishment of expertise and discourses of kind of intellectual dominance are huge distractions and stumbling blocks, I think, that are holding all of us collectively back from getting to where we need to go. It leads to, for example, the desire to claim IP. I know it's really challenging in the academy, right? It's very, very important how you establish yourself within the canon. That becomes a huge part of your professional progress. But similarly, I think that and I've even heard in some of the discussions, people talking from the perspective of their particular professional expertise or trajectory of training, and then putting in opposition to someone else, which is largely done in a playful manner, but I think actually masks a certain friction of trying to claim that expertise for oneself and one professional cohort, rather in a way that prevents us from finding points of commonality and collaboration. And I recognize it in myself, which is why I'm raising this point. So I am not here as an expert in regenerative design and development. I'm here as an advocate for the shift towards a life-centered economy, towards design and development in right relation to place. But that I don't want to talk about it through the lens of expertise. I think it's more through the lens of mutual sharing and learning and curiosity. Because if we're going to untangle our existing knot, all the challenges that have been raised today, let alone weave a new life-centric tapestry together, it's going to take all of us. And hopefully tonight will yield some fruitful conversations and some fruitful questions. So let's see how we go. That's been a lot. We've been sitting inside in a room with no windows for almost all day. It's probably getting close to nightfall outside. And I think that I always find it helpful when my head is too full of ideas and thoughts, just to take a moment and pause and find a space where I can look out at the horizon, and ideally a space where I can feel small, So meaning in right humility in the context with which I find myself, rather than the centered, dominating narrator of my life. And I think what's helpful about situating oneself in a landscape is that it helps us avoid, or it helps us to exert discernment around abstraction. And I think that this is something that many of us, certainly in the sort of curatorial, editorial class within urbanism and the social dimensions of urbanism, have sometimes fallen into this trap of a certain abstraction of systems. And I know that's how we make sense of them, but I think it's very difficult to be in right relation to, say, a network of energy centers across a continent. It's a really important consideration, and I'm so happy that that people like Deb are thinking about things in these terms. But I think particularly for those of us maybe who are interested in articulating new routes towards bringing more people from outside of the profession along with us, because essentially that's the political project. So it's thinking about how we articulate the transition to a livable future to our clients, to our politicians, to our neighbors who might be who might have different priorities in their lives than we are. It can be quite challenging to convey that transition in abstract terms and to think about the right scale at which that transition becomes tangible and can become desirable in an applied and personal way, so that people will feel a personal stake that can overcome the fear, fight, flight, freeze response that we talked about earlier. And this is why I love looking to the work of artists. In this case, this is Tiffany Chung looking at the flows of refugees from Vietnam and their places of original landing and eventual settlement. And I think that I find it really interesting to think about how we can communicate some of these ideas about global displacement, cultural transfer, cultural encounter, through other lenses. So it doesn't necessarily mean always a change of scale, but it can be a change of lens and interpretation. Similarly, when it comes to cities themselves, I think that we often settle on a city as a scale of something that feels just about the right fit for what we just might manage. It's like the outer bound of what we just might be able to manage, to understand, to intervene with at a systems level. I'm definitely a signed up, card-carrying urbanist. I can't deny the pull of that. But I think, again, we need to be a little bit careful when we, communicating with broader communities, building political coalitions about what boundaries we draw. This is an example from a project from ages ago in London, where we worked with Piper's models to build density models of a number of global cities. Here, Mexico City, it's like this idea of making the city tangible as an object made it very easy to talk about on an abstract level and interact with on a sort of tactical level, but I'm not sure that that actually achieved anything successfully politically or did anything to actively improve anyone's life. So, where and at what scale can we begin to look at for green shoots? For examples of the new livable future that we want, tangible examples of these emerging futures that are more closely aligned with the life-centered economy. And I really do think this is not quite at the building scale, but really more at a neighborhood scale. And that's not to say that that can't be in constellation with many other neighborhoods in a way that does scale across. But I genuinely think that the unit of political change and communication and engagement really is at the neighborhood scale. And would like to talk very briefly about a number of projects and what this might convey about factors to consider in designing and developing for a livable future. In Singapore, there's a huge conversation around, well, density is just non-debatable because the national narrative is about land scarcity, and hence there is a increasing discussion of multi-layered juxtaposition of different uses and user groups, now with an increasing incorporation of the more than human world in this. And in an increasingly aging population, also the incorporation of multi-generational living. There are tremendous challenges with this. There's still a high amount of embodied carbon, but I think it's a very interesting idea of bringing this intensity and juxtaposition of users and uses into close proximity to one another. Similarly, there are agendas for reclaiming underutilized roof spaces in Singapore, as with other densely built metropolitan areas around the world. What I find interesting about this one is, in contrast to the kind of techno-utopian engineering and aesthetic of the skyscrapers around it, it really is actually looking at soil-based agriculture, about creating right livelihoods, and about drawing on a traditional knowledge about growing plants that are specific to this very region. Similarly, Singapore has some very interesting policies about creating coexistence. There are enforced policies of racial integration, which I think would probably be impossible to execute in a place like Australia, but nevertheless an interesting one to consider. Especially looking at trends in other regions where we see intentional self-segregation happening along political, if not necessarily racial, but political lines in markets like the United States. But I do not wish to idealize this, because if we look back to the concept of flows, Singapore's national interracial harmony is also underpinned by a tiered system of immigration statuses for neighbors from Southeast Asia, who do not necessarily have a guaranteed right or route in to get citizenship status. So it's not an ideal situation, but it's one that raises several questions about coexistence and how that can be brokered at a neighborhood level in relation to a regional and a national level of policy. I think that this level of engagement, really proper participatory design and engagement, as seen here in a neighborhood scale consultation around the Seoul Metropolitan Plan, which is part of a long-term turn away from the dictatorship in South Korea towards a much more invigorated and politically participatory, iterative planning policy, which is still held fairly robust under a change of mayor, to truly thinking about how we can activate participatory planning capabilities, not just in ourselves as built environment professionals, which was the subject of one of the panels earlier today, but also building those capacities in those we would seek to be in service to, as seen in a number of initiatives in the Philippines here. This is one by Alexander Frunis and Sudar Kadka. And fundamentally, I think when we think about design, we need to think about how we are not just building environments, but we are also building spaces of encounter, spaces of capability building, and particularly, I would say, from a political perspective, if we're looking to counter the wave of populism around the world that we need to also be thinking about creating really meaningful right livelihoods. And this is an area where, in discussion with some of the folks from Melbourne Uni, I think it would be fascinating to see what sorts of collaborations might be brokered between the School of Architecture Built Environment and technical colleges, for example, or in conversation with unions, because it's not just, again, it's not just about building capacity at the design side, it's also about building capacity at the delivery side, and ideally making that this irresistible, for example, making the transition to biomaterials, not some weird hippie thing, but actually this absolutely irresistible draw to a livable future. And as designers, can we, when we're working in a really embedded way in specific localities, can we think about how the cultivation and recovery of the diversity of the ethnosphere, which is the anthropologist Wade Davis's term for the sum of all human cultures that have ever existed on the planet, and all of their very embedded, place-embedded specificity, how can we seek to enhance that through the design work that we do? I understand you had DNA Architects principal here speaking at the school. Great inspiration for us with Flourish. Because actually I have come to believe very strongly that it is through this re-education about and cultivation of the ethnosphere that we have any shot of coming back into harmony with the biosphere. So with the rest of life. So how can we lean into that as designers, design researchers? But we've talked, it's really appealing to lean into just those things that we want to lift up, that we want to scale out, that we want to learn from. I think fundamentally it's also very, very important that we get very specific about a few things that we need to respectfully hospice and transition out. So I'm not talking about a frame of execution, but taking a cue from the growing group Hospicine Modernity. What are the key parts of our systems that need to depart to make room for the new? Because just looking at the example of energy, you'll remember from Deb's diagram, it has not been enough to just add good. We actually need to say goodbye respectfully and with gratitude, but definitively to some things that no longer serve us. So the extractive economy, I was so happy to hear so much focus on materiality in today's conversations, and really creating new place-embedded systems of material economies for our built environment. This also means contending with the energy conversation. Deb spoke really glowingly and excitingly about the potential of a transition to solar, and I've seen the policy papers about making Australia a clean energy superpower. That's really exciting, but we also need to say definitively goodbye to coal and gas. And just putting this up there as a provocation and speaking from someone who's operating in a territory where this sort of protest is like absolutely unthinkable. Knowing what we know about that fizz popping off the top of that Great Gatsby champagne glass, I mean, what are we actually going to do about it? I was very heartened by Rachel Reeves recently, the UK Chancellor, coming out with a budget that actually overtly taxes the specific, private jets at a much higher rate than other forms of passenger aircraft. But I think that's really just the first beginnings of it. So again, I know this will make some designers feel really itchy and really wiggly in their seats, but what I'm not necessarily saying that you as a designer need to contend with this issue, but that you as a whole holistic person, part of which is as a designer, you as a citizen actively need to contend with this, especially because if you're in the room, you are in Australia, and you have a robust democracy that has not yet been fully captured. So enjoy it and use it, please, on the behalf of those for whom that is not the case. And finally, how can we look to thinking back to these spaces, a developing space of encounter, developing spaces where we can see the fruitful, productive juxtaposition of people from different backgrounds and ways of life in making the kind of neighborhoods that we want? How can we think about welcoming all of those who are already on the move and all of those who very soon will be on the move, given what we saw from that report about how climate destabilization is going to drive mass migration? How can we be generous hosts? And how can we consider the real spatial implications and the human aspects of these journeys? Here again, I find the perspective of an artist incredibly helpful in terms of the developing a more robust, in this case, a photojournalist, but being displayed as an artist, I would say. Brought Ali Batour documenting his and a cohort of refugees' journeys from Afghanistan to finally to successful resettlement in Australia. But yeah, how can we begin to think about these, our relationships in the wealthy, highly advantaged world, high carbon world? How can we think about our relationships with those who will be coming in a really generous and positive and open-hearted way? So finally, what does this mean for you? And again, here I'm going to share a slight complication in my thinking that's developed since we wrote Flourish. So I've always been inspired by the policy expert and marine biologist, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She's got a great new book out. And she often recommends that when people are feeling stuck on climate action, that they look at this sort of Venn diagram of where they should act. What are you good at? What is the work that needs doing? And what brings you joy? Beautiful, right? That you should start there. I still think this is great advice, but I also think we have to remember that it comes from an American individualistic perspective, so maybe might resonate well with some Australian perspectives. But I think that we also need to understand that we can't just take action from ourselves without first thinking about what position we are in ourselves. So what are we in relation to? So in the very first instance, how does that self relate to all of these other layers of embedded community, out from family to coworkers to bodies of professional practice to neighbors to people who live in the same state as you, et cetera. But also, how does that relate to the work that we have to do within ourselves to be fully holistically integrated? And also, how do we think about ourselves in position to power structures? So I gave a talk to a business audience in Malaysia earlier this year. And an incredibly sweet person passed me this note, basically saying, super friendly, really kind, generous response, but basically saying, I'm completely values aligned with you, but my professional position basically blocks me from being able to fully accept what you have to say. And at first, I felt quite sorry for him and I felt a bit judgy for him. But when I was putting this presentation together and I was scanning this, I realized what stationery it was written on. And I realized what conference venue I'd been speaking in. So I'd been speaking in a venue within a golf and country club and a convention center owned by one of the largest kind of industrial conglomerates in Malaysia, huge amount of income from palm oil plantations. And I had happily accepted this invitation, happily accepted their honorarium, and probably also limited some of the remarks that I made because of that context, because I knew someone from the sponsor was actually sitting next to me. So I think all of us actually have this frame where the actions that we take in relation to the world are not simply framed in terms of like, where's the work needed, what gives us joy, what are we good at, but they are also constrained by the context within which we nest. And that's something that we need to have really clear eyes about so we can kind of take action accordingly. And so I really strongly think that rather than just thinking about ourselves, this is how we work with most of our clients at Desire Lines, it's really thinking about the self, whether that's you as an individual or your organization, within this strong embedded ecosystem of institutions or group that contribute to knowledge creation and scholarship. A lot of folks in the room, the conveners of this symposium. What contributions are we making to civil society? Who benefits from our services and work? Who has the resources to support us? And especially, who are our comparators and possible peers that we might work with? Rather than thinking about them immediately as our competitors, going immediately back into that idea of I am the sole author who needs the credit. How can we start to think differently, even within a professional context? And this, of course, all nests within the natural system and the geography within which we are acting. And fundamentally, I think the approach is that if we are going to come back into right relation with place, that will first necessitate us coming back into embodied understanding of ourselves and our own positions, and our cultivation of capacity to interconnect with and across categories of difference with those who are actually active in the same time space that we are. And this is what can move us into the capacity, the space for repair, which is what the coming months, years, decades are going to require of us as a species, and that we can see in place in some of the places that give me the most hope. Here, these are places where people really stay with the trouble and choose to face their fears, but in a way that's really embodied and applied in their specific spatial context. So this is the Los Angeles Eco-Village, which I think is a very interesting comparator for an Australian urban context, actually. It's on the edge of Koreatown in Los Angeles, where they're following a racialized police brutality incident. There was massive unrest, civil unrest that led to the destruction of properties, a huge damaged property, some loss of life, but essentially just this absolute fragmentation through this kind of conflict of difference that had been terribly managed. With spatial implications, a group of people chose, rather than to escape the city, rather than the flight, they chose to stay and they chose to heal through the creation of community land trust and all sorts of different actions of repair, repair to landscape, repair to the refurbishment of the existing building stock, constructions of the creation of new forms of governance, the creation of new right livelihoods, incubation of spaces of learning. Any of you who want to visit are warmly welcome to go visit. They will take you around, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, the restoration of our downtowns and the ability to, this is, of course, the famous example of Cheonggyecheng Stream in downtown Seoul in Korea, but I'm sure we can think of other examples where the reversal of mistakes made at a massive level have led to this incredible new life-centered spaces. But I think this is one example that really bears consideration, where the Los Angeles Eco Village one obviously has a very strong message for us when we think about the managing of coexistence of difference and how we build capacity to manage conflict, redistribute wealth, broker fruitful exchange across really difficult conversations. This one speaks to, if you are in a position where you can be creating massive infrastructure projects, maybe consider carefully how you're going to think about them in 5 or 10 years' time. Does that help you to manage your planning process more gracefully? And might you instead think about moving to life-centered first rather than having to undo a massive investment of carbon? And finally, what have I seen on the ground here in Melbourne this last week? The Tressor Fellowship, as Dan mentioned, has been incredibly generous at supporting my time getting to explore this beautiful city, which deserves all of its international recognition as a livable place. And I've been so heartened to see real examples of the development of what the British writer and advocate George Monbiot calls the important juxtaposition or complementarity of public luxury with private sufficiency. In this case, visiting one of the Nightingale developed areas in Brunswick with Sarah. Interestingly, I absolutely loved the housing. I know I'm not the first to say I absolutely love the housing, incredibly clever, efficient use of smaller spaces, stripped down finishes, et cetera. But what I found very interesting was that this amazing park, which is really the beating heart of this neighborhood, was not their plan. They wanted just more housing. So I think it's also important to consider that even a nonprofit developer who are doing fantastic work that I fully love and support, that fruitful dialogue and tension between the public and private and third sectors in creating cities that are purpose-built for all is really where it's at. Also, the community-led rewilding efforts and access on Mary Creek, which a dear friend took me to enjoy over the weekend. Just this beautiful, again, just you could feel, smell, the life-giving reconnection with place, or in Australia with country, so apparent, just a turn from a dense urban neighborhood. And also the reimagined Birrung exhibition. I think we had a discussion yesterday about the power of the urban imaginary and the role that design can play in articulating new futures, for new desirable life-centered futures for our cities. And I thought that this was really on display very clearly in these plans looking ahead to 2070. And then the work that's being done to create these new living frameworks that offer the potential for reconciliation and integration between some of these ways of thinking, like the planetary boundaries and the donut, but in very place-based, specific, ethnosphere enriching, culturally appropriate context of concepts of country. This here is an image very kindly pointed to me by Regen Melbourne, documenting an event that they recently held in conjunction with the Indigenous Donut Advocacy Group, trying to look at how there is commonality between these two shared visions. So finally, what does the future look like? Does the future look like intense, very robust, very carbon intensive infrastructure built on models from the last century. In some cases, it will. But if we think about leaning into a life-centered future and in service, how we can be in service to that future coming into fruition, I think it's very, very important that we start looking to examples and learnings from the rest of the living world. And whether that's looking at things metaphorically or actually through a rigorous scientific engagement with all of the different complementary disciplines within the life sciences, for example. I'd say, how can our future of our cities, thinking our way beyond this terrifying gauntlet that we're just entering, how can we think more like and learn from the rest of nature, which really does work in collaboration, work over and around and through obstacles very creatively and collaboratively. How can we open our minds and our hearts to that new form of wisdom from the rest of the web of life that sustains us? I look forward to, for those of you who can stay, we do have a drink afterwards, but for those of you who can stay, I look forward to hearing your thoughts, questions, pushback on any of these ideas, and especially hearing any examples you might have of a life-centered future that we can all get excited about.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And what a great image to have on screen behind us at the end. I feel like just leaving that up there all the time. It was such a beautiful, careful, thoughtful talk, and you could tell there was completely rapt attention in the audience there. So thank you so much for laying this out for us. We do have drinks outside, but it would be good to have some time. I know you wanted to have a little bit of time for questions. So if you're okay with shaving 5 minutes off your drinking, which
We started
probably,
a bit late as well, didn't we?
it's probably good for all of our health, let's face it. Let's have some questions, if you like, from the audience. So if there's anybody who wants to say a question or a comment, or as you said, push back or push forwards, either way.
The drink is calling.
I can tell. Yeah, go on. Alan's got one. Oh, there's one right at the back as well. Right at the front and right at the back. Look at that. It's a good workout for our student volunteers. So at the back, yeah.
Oh, at the back, that's me.
Yes.
This is strange. I'm just wondering where the room is for community and academia to work together.
Huge. And
No, it's big, but yeah.
that so really specifically, I think that there's room for, in certain, so I chair the board of Singapore's basically only advocacy organization for participatory design, so that tells you the state of our civil society there. But they're doing fantastic work, and they have grown from strength to strength over the last 10 years. And they have managed to broker a position of trust with the government, who is kind of a make or break deal. But I do feel that they have been strongly legitimized in that relationship, not only through the work that the nonprofit has done directly with community, but also certain accreditation that has come from the nonprofit leadership's affiliation with the university. And the university have engaged them to equip other built environment professionals with participatory design capabilities. And at the same time, that has sort of it's not that community work needs to be legitimized per se, but in terms of the channeling of resources, at least in our particular context, that's been incredibly helpful. I'd also love to hear, Dan's thoughts in terms of, when you curated that roundtable session we had the other day, there was a great representation, from government, your colleagues from the university, also some community groups.
Yeah.
What role do you see for School of Design?
Also huge. As in, I think a lot of us have an ambition to, in a way, flip the school inside out in that respect, or the faculty or the university more broadly, and to connect it to questions or matters of concern in communities. And for us, as you said very kindly, for us to be a convener for some of those difficult conversations, we can work in a way, to use a high carbon analogy, like the cement between the bricks there to some degree.
The mycelium.
Thank you. The mycelium between the cross-laminated timber. But so with industry, community, with government, various levels of government, etc., we do have an ability to some extent to be independent within that and to hold difficult questions or spaces, as I hope we've tried to do today. So that's one way we can do it, by convening, and another way would be to fold into our research projects, into the education practices that we do in a very structural way, by opening up scholarships and ways of people who haven't traditionally been enabled to come to Melbourne Uni to directly participate as students, researchers, and staff ultimately, but also through our daily activities here. And that for us is massively interesting, and I think genuinely a useful role, one of the useful roles with the university.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, really useful. We have one done. Alan, you can go for it, and then we have one more here.
Thank you. Great talk, Sarah, very inspirational. And in your book, you write eloquently about mutualism. I noted that tonight you talked about democracy, but do the two actually fit together as practiced? And I know democracy is something that's different everywhere, but it has some, this tendency to be captured. And how is mutualism different? And it's perhaps a challenge to provide a precise answer, but it seems to me that it's important.
Such a great question. I think it does come down again to scale. So if you look at the example I shared of both the Seoul Plan and the Los Angeles Eco Village, those two really promising examples of healing after significant rupture, that in one case, racialized civil unrest, in the other case, a military dictatorship. That in both of those cases, the appropriate form of organization has depended on the scale at which we're talking. So in the Los Angeles Eco Village, they have a community land trust that holds most of the day-to-day governance decisions, which are sometimes fraught and have had a huge, over the decades, as I understand it from residents, have had a huge iterative learning curve, all of that work within self and work within communication, but really more of a mutual, reciprocal, what we might understand as a community or type scale of organization. But they in turn do have appointed community representatives who interface with local government. So over, for example, needing to have different approaches to how the landscaping or pavement might be treated from a typical Los Angeles street management perspective. Although I was super happy to see Deb's example that this mindset may be changing at scale in Los Angeles. Very, very promising. She showed it, for those who didn't see Deb's presentation, she showed an example of trying to scale up that level of community engagement around livable infrastructure. in Los Angeles. So there, yeah. So I mean, and I've seen pictures of Lois, one of the founding group, proudly standing with the mayor in his office. So the two things do coexist, and I think similarly for the Soul Plan, that some of the consultation process was facilitated directly by civil servants, but as the iterations of consultation have gotten more robust, they have understood that in order to be able to include more representative groups that were more fully representative of the diversity of Seoul Metro, that they had to work with civil society organizations. And so again, you see a sort of, that could represent either specific geographies or specific demographic groups, and those would be coming from either just a community organization or more formalized third sector representing a minoritized group. Does that help to answer some of it? But I think it's really about like nesting scales and trying to decide, and that's really is the work of design, I think, also like how nesting scales interact. And the dean and I in our conversation, Julie was mentioning that she really values the way that everyone who comes through the school comes out able to think in 3 dimensions. And I think that there is, I know that's meant spatially, but I think there is something about being able to activate that form of thinking that can help designers think a little bit more robustly and ideally in a nonlinear way about how the systems that we create.
Yeah. Thank you. I think one more question and then we really should get you out of here. Down here in the middle. Or maybe it's not at the back. That's a good goal.
Thank you, Sarah, and for all the speakers today. I guess it's kind of actually building on what you were just saying there around the nesting of scales. You touched on the idea that our actions are constrained by the context in which we nest. How can designers in their particular role, whether they're urban designers or service designers, anyone, or even doing policy, how can they create environments that encourage more sustainable behaviours and choices for the people living in their really hyper-local urban realm? Do we need to embrace further intersectionality in design and policy across the way that design is educated? And how might we go about doing that?
How long do you have? No. Let's see, how can we break that down? So as multiple speakers today have mentioned, it'd be great to collaborate across faculties, and I think that just to be super clear, I am not advocating that designers should be able to do everything. It's actually really, really advocating that designers lose our shell of needing to be experts who are defending space, actually become really engaged collaborators and understand what we don't know and where we need to be really curious and when we need to bring in expertise, whether that's in ecology or sociology or community organizing, et cetera. So I don't think designers necessarily need to own all of that space in that context of like, our professional bodies need to develop all of this expertise, but rather it's the ability to forge alliances and to come into fruitful discourse and collaboration with others who might have complementary skill sets. So that's on that. The first part of your question was about sustainable lifestyles. I guess it's like thinking to that example that I showed from Brunswick of like, how can we both, I mean, there's a really strong design planning aspect in the allocation of the park, design aspect and thinking about how to make that public luxury as amazing as possible on constrained budgets, I'm sure, within a constrained site. And similarly, how to, Breathe and all the other architects who collaborated on that Nightingale Village that borders the park, how do they make sufficiency really desirable? And as well, so that those two, I think that example as a unit shows really beautifully how architects, interior designers, landscape architects, and planners all have a role to play in shaping that fabric at a neighborhood level in a way that embodies these more life-centered ways of living.
I think we'd better leave it there, because clearly it could go on, but it's probably better if it goes on over there. So thank you once again so much, Sarah. I really liked your starting point, or about a third of the way when you talked about clarity and things becoming clear, and I think you've helped actually make a lot of things very clear for us in a very beautiful, elegant way that still leaves us all able to find a place for further questions and further ideas within that. So let me get you to join me in thanking Sarah once again. And as it says up there, you can also keep hassling Sarah over a drink out there. So before you go, there's just a few more extra things to say. It says closing remarks, Dan to close the day. I'm not going to do that because it would be impossible to summarize everything we've heard, and B, I don't want to rattle on any more than I already have. But I do want to say thank you once again to everybody I thanked at the start of it, in terms of the organizing committee and all of the helpers and everybody that's made this happen. Thanks to all the speakers who came here as well. I will just say this question of saying yes to the good, but also no to the bad, is a very useful way for us to sort of think carefully about how we do that on the way out of the room. And thanks to all of you for your careful and respectful attention and discussions, and for such intent listening and attending today. It's been really delightful for us to host you. Thank you once again. I would just say, we are a school, and we have a big end-of-year show next Thursday. Starts next Thursday. MSDX, it's called, which is where the Bachelor of Design and all of the grad school has all of their work on display. You can find information about that online. It's open to the public, and it's open to the public for a couple of weeks after the opening night, but please do come along to the opening night. For those of you that are attending site visits tomorrow, because the symposium does not stop, today was just the kind of opening up of the questions. Tomorrow we've got a bunch of site visits. Please do ensure that you arrive at the meeting point on time, it says here, so do as you're told, please. But those site visits will be excellent, so take part in that if you can. A recording of all of the keynote lectures that you've heard today in the panel sessions will be on the MSD YouTube channel, so sign up to that, as they say, and watch out for that too. And please join us in the foyer for some light refreshments. Thank you once again.